Backend authentication is the process of checking credentials with another system. The purpose is static password validation. There are 4 protocols that can be used: Windows, LDAP, Radius, Custom Backend Protocol. LDAP is supported for Active Directory, eDirectory and ADAM 2003. An Identikey server can authenticate Windows users via Windows or LDAP Active Directory Backend Authentication. Windows Backend Authentication should be used where the Identikey server is installed on a Windows machine which is a member server of the Windows domain. LDAP Backend Authentication may be used where the machine on which it is installed is either not a member server of the Windows domain, or running a Linux operating system. The Lightweight Directory Access Protocol is an application protocol for querying and modifying directory services running over TCP/IP. A directory server stores and organizes information about users, computers, groups, resources, and this based upon LDAP. When using Active Directory as a data store for Identikey, you can use the Windows API and Radius as backend servers. When using ODBC as a data store for Identikey, you can use the Windows API, Radius and LDAP as backend servers. When LDAP backend is used, we need to determine the domain name of the user to locate the proper LDAP record in Identikey. To find the backend server, Identikey will translate the server name into an IP address, so a record is needed in DNS, or you can alternatively place an entry in the local host file. A directory service requires a binding string to set up the communication, separated by a comma, and starting with the lowest object in the tree. Microsoft Active Directory does not need a specific user to set up the LDAP binding, better known as a service record principle. On a Microsoft Active Directory, we can use the user and credentials of the user that wants to authenticate to set up the binding. In Microsoft ADAM and Novell eDirectory, you will need a service record principle. The steps in backend authentication for Active Directory are: Step 1. Identify the Active Directory domain controller using the LDAP backend server entries in the data store or the global catalog. Step 2. Identikey server will bind to the directory server that handles the authentication request. It will use the user ID and the password specified in the authentication request received by the Identikey server. If the bind succeeds, the user authentication is deemed to be successful. If the bind fails, the authentication is deemed to have failed. The global catalog is a distributed data repository that contains a searchable, partial representation of every object in every domain in a multi-domain Active Directory forest. The global catalog is stored on domain controllers that have been designated as global catalog servers and is distributed through multi-master replication. Searches that are directed to the global catalog are faster because they do not involve referrals to different domain controllers. You can specify one global catalog name. Identikey will translate the server name into an IP address. Identikey will then ask the global catalog for a list of domain controllers in the appropriate DNS domain name. Identikey will then look up the appropriate domain controller DNS service record in _msdcs.dns domain name records to perform the backend authentication. The backend server settings are displayed here. You can click on the Edit button to change this info. If you have multiple forests, you cannot use the global catalog and you will need to set up different LDAP records for each domain. Microsoft ADAM must be enabled with universal password and the end users must be enabled to manage their own passwords. The steps in backend authentication for ADAM are: Step 1. Identify the ADAM server based on the ADAM backend entries in Identikey server. Step 2. Bind to ADAM using the security principal DN and password defined for the ADAM backend if principal details are specified. Step 3. Search ADAM for the FQDN of the user that has to be authenticated, starting from the base search DN. Step 4. Try to authenticate with ADAM using a bind with the FQDN and password of the user to be authenticated. Fill in the proper values to create the new backend. The record contains the IP addresses, the port number and some control parameters for connecting. Also, a priority between a number of backend servers can be defined by assigning them a priority. The backend server with the highest priority will be contacted first. Search starts from a base distinguished name. Particular servers can be assigned to a given domain. If anonymous binding is disabled, the security principal DN has to be an ADAM account that belongs to the reader's role. Click Create to continue the process or cancel to stop the creation. Novel eDirectory must be version 8.7 or higher and must be enabled with universal password. The steps in backend authentication for Novel eDirectory are: Step 1. Identify the eDirectory server based on the eDirectory backend entries in Identikey server. Step 2. Bind to eDirectory using the security principal DN and password defined for the eDirectory backend if principal details specified. Step 3. Search eDirectory for the FQDN of the user that has to be authenticated, starting from the base search DN. Step 4. Try to authenticate with eDirectory using a bind with the FQDN and password of the user to be authenticated. Fill in the proper values to create the new backend. The record contains the IP addresses, the port number and some control parameters for connecting. Also, a priority between a number of backend servers can be defined by assigning them a priority. The backend server with the highest priority will be contacted first. Particular servers can be assigned to a given domain. Search starts from a base distinguished name. If anonymous binding is disabled on the eDirectory server, the security principal DN has to be an eDirectory account that has the necessary permissions to search the directory for the user accounts that have to be authenticated. Click Create to continue the process or cancel to stop the creation. Identikey server can be used in Radius environments to handle the authentication part, which is only one functionality of the AAA capabilities of Radius. AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, Accounting. Even in this one environment, multiple configurations are possible. Identikey can pass Radius return attributes from the backend. Supported with following protocols: PAP, CHAP, MS-CHAP, MS-CHAP2 with MP.